All I know is if there's a giant like Illuminati of climate scientists that are like living it up, I'm not part of it. And where's my invite? But for the most part, scientists I know are hardworking. They seek the truth, and for the most part, physics doesn't lie. So, you know, believe scientists. They're not out there to fool you into doing something weird.
Hello and welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast, where we have incredible and insightful conversations about all things planetary health, environmentalism, sustainability, so we can create a clean, green, and sustainable future for us, the planet, and all beings. I'm your host here on the show, Tom Simak. I'm an athlete and fellow plant eater who strives to optimize every living ecosystem. Passionate about looking after this beautiful floating rock we call home. Before we get into the episode, I just want to mention that every single one of these conversations is featured on the YouTubes, and this is for those visually inclined. It's also a great way to engage with the episode. So if you guys have a comment, something you like, something you didn't like, YouTube is a great way to really engage in that conversation. So I'll leave the link to do so and go onto the YouTube in the show notes below and comment your thoughts. I respond to every single one of those and I appreciate them. Today we are talking to Lenore Newman, a Canadian author and geographer holding a PhD in environmental studies from Toronto's York University. Lenore is an associate professor of geography and the environment at the University of the Fraser Valley and director of Food and Agriculture Institute. She has published over 50 academic journal articles and book chapters. The topics are predominantly on the future of farmland use and other food-related issues. In today's exchange, what you can expect is a lot of talk about how, in the world, we can feed a growing human population with the agricultural systems we have available to us. It's a topic that's much debated, so I think this conversation is super productive. With that being said, I'll see you on the other side. Lenore, welcome to the podcast. How are you going?
Oh, very well. Glad to be here today.
Really stoked to have you. I initially came across your work when I was doing research into the concept of foods going extinct, something that I was previously almost completely oblivious with, besides a little bit of knowledge on the Gros Michel banana, I believe it was called. But when I started diving into the concept of coffee and cacao beans and homing pigeons, it really it alarmed me, given that I felt like I was someone that was educated, yet this complete area was unbeknownst to me. Do you find that people are generally shocked when it comes to this field?
Well, it is true. And when I wrote the book Lost Feast on culinary extinction, that's really how it evolved. Is someone made an offhand remark to me that, well, food species are probably really well protected because we have a reason. We want them. So surely they don't go extinct. And I got in my head a bit. And I was like, passenger pigeons went extinct. So I know about those. And I started to kind of collect them a little bit and realized that actually food species often go extinct and that humanity is really bad at eating things to death, in effect, actually loving them too hard. And mostly animal species and especially oceanic species, but also some plants, which surprised me. It seems like we shouldn't be able to drive plants to extinction, but we can, and we often do so through the kitchen. So that was it. Kind of opened my mind as well as I worked on it.
Oh, for sure. Because there's so many different reasons from what I found that this actually happens. And I think a lot of it, in my research anyway, it comes towards our hunger and, like you say, our love for the food, and what is almost like this mix of now this industrialization. Because, I mean, I'm curious to hear your take. When we're looking back to like the homing pigeon, and for those who
I don't know if you'll be able to do a better debrief on that, but it was essentially the chicken of the 1800s, I believe it was, and people made stews and curries and all these dishes with the homing pigeon. And this was pre-industrialized agriculture in how we see it now. So I think people are very surprised to hear that the homing pigeon went extinct, and now it's completely different to how we kind of grow corn, where it's two or three species. So there is what seems to be like a myriad of different problems that we have. What are we doing wrong as a society?
Well, and that's a big question. And I would say, let's see, the best way to answer that is number one, a lot of people are really surprised to find out I'm very pro technology, in that sometimes they assume that I'm saying we should go back to how we used to farm. But the problem is, we actually caused a lot of problems with how we used to farm. And the future of food really involves sort of deconstructing that and looking at how do we do this in a way that preserves as much of the natural world as possible. Because the real problem we're dealing with is the way we farm is very inefficient. And as you mentioned, very focused on single crops, to the point where it covers about 40% of the Earth's land surface we use to produce food. So, one of the ones, and this is a drum I beat a lot, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit, is we use an inordinate amount of land to produce animal protein, but it only makes up a small portion of the calories we eat because it's very inefficient. So we grow a lot of corn to feed to animals. They convert it at about a 6% efficiency, 10% efficiency for smaller animals, and then we eat them. And it's really a bad way to do it. So, I often say if you want to preserve food species, the first thing to do is, go plant-based. It's so I really see that the number one thing we're doing wrong, we're eating way too many animal products, and they're really inefficient. So that's number one. Number two, we're taking too much of the Earth's land surface to produce food. And that means much less space available for the wild lands that we need to actually preserve all these species. So those are two really big ones right off the start, and that's a lot. So maybe I'll leave it there because those are both really big concepts.
Yeah, I mean, preserving land is definitely something that has been on my radar since this whole stat has become very pronounced that like the small indigenous populations of the world protect 80% of the biodiversity we have, and we are not doing them any favors at all with the rate of farming and deforestation that we're really contributing to. But I think I really want to dive into what you said earlier. So you said obviously we know here the environmental impacts of animal products. It's really quite a funny concept how inefficient it is. But once someone is, say, plant-based, you're already making a huge step in regards to your carbon footprint. But what else is there? Like, so we mentioned the fact that there's two or three species of corn that human beings really focus on. There's the Cavendish banana that is just the bee's knees in this world. So is it realistic for someone to try these different species of food? How does someone source that? Or even is that important?
Well, the one good thing is it's gotten a lot better over the last few decades. And I'm old enough to remember food in the 1980s, and it was pretty brutal. There was not a lot of diversity. We sort of hit a low point in North America and Europe and around the sort of industrialized world. We hit a bit of a low point in the 80s, in which we're really not eating many species at all. And it has gotten a little better. And part of that has been through people getting really engaged with food. So that can be everything from food activists who've really tried to bring back, local variety. And, if I think about, say, the West Coast context here in North America, there was a lot of push to restart the farmers markets in San
Mm-hmm.
Francisco, for example. And that really diversified food available on the West Coast. There were chefs really central to that whole movement as well. People like Alice Waters, Wolfgang Puck, who really pushed to bring back varieties. But also, and it's a weird one, the Food Network has done so much for this. It's introduced
Really?
average people to like weird roots and all these strange berries they probably never thought about. Suddenly they're using gooseberries, and they're like, I want to go try that because Kat Cora cooked with that. I want to go try and track it down. So, and there's definitely been a bit of a renaissance, and that's really important. And it's sort of connected to a movement of trying to diversify. Also, we are seeing more localization, which is great. And I think it is important. Although, yeah, I mean, and I think also, don't you feel like when people go plant-based, it also tends to expand, their minds a little bit around cooking, and I think of it this way as, if you're used to cooking in that kind of French model of, oh, look, it's a chunk of meat and it's in a fat and you're going to eat that. And then you start to say, okay, well, I got all these vegetables. What I'm going to do? You have to actually be a little more creative. And I think, we're seeing, it's so nice to see more plant-based available in the world, for sure.
For sure, absolutely. It's funny because you are put in a position where you have to be creative. You have to use some level of inspiration for different spices and different ways of cooking and preparing and cutting and all these different things. But I wanted to circle in on something you said. So you said localization. Now, I want to dive into what exactly that means because I'm not even 100%, but I'm sure some people maybe don't know how to do that properly because I'm sure there's lots of different ways to even think about that ideology. So I'd love to take a moment to really explore that idea.
Yeah, and it can mean a lot of things. And it does vary depending on where you are. Because, here I'm sitting on the west coast of North America in Vancouver in British Columbia. And so I'm probably going to get all my grains and pulses from the prairies in the middle of the continent. And that makes sense. It actually makes total sense, makes sense energetically. That's where they grow. They put them in rail cars, roll them down to the coast. It all works. But if I go to buy lettuce here, it's probably coming from California, from the Salinas Valley. By the time I get it, it's probably 8 days old. It's expensive. It's very road worn. It's very frustrating. And so really, my life would be a lot better and my carbon footprint would be better if, and there's a couple of alternatives. Number one, in the summer, because I mean, this is Canada, right? So in summer, hopefully someone should be growing lettuce within the proverbial 100 miles of me. And I can buy their lettuce and it'll be really good. And it will be much better for the planet. In the winter, though, one of the things we're seeing emerge that I think is really good, but it's a bit counterintuitive. In the winter, we can use green energy to grow lettuce indoors. And that's a really neat development too, because then I'm still getting that fresh lettuce. It's still local, but it's growing in a building, which kind of got to get your head around a bit. But the carbon footprint of that is still better than that California lettuce. And I really feel that we're coming to the end of the era where we fly like a leafy green around the planet. It makes no sense.
No, it doesn't. Well, let's explore this growing in a building concept because in my mind that's called hydroponics, I believe. So how does that work and what is the potential solution that this has in terms of reducing a nation's or an individual's footprint?
Yeah, well, I think and we're seeing this emerge as a really strong category of technology. So a lot of people are looking at how leafy greens in particular are produced. And you might think, well, what does it matter, leafy greens? But they're actually a pretty big category. And they're also good for us. And yet, in winter, in large parts of the world, you're bringing them a really long distance. and they do have this carbon impact. They also bring a lot of water with them. So if you're growing them in drought-prone areas, you're then literally shipping water away. It's a bad idea. So it didn't really make sense to grow them indoors until fairly recently with, much cheaper LED lighting that is much more efficient. So at this point, we can grow, like you say, hydroponically, we can grow greens indoors. And we can save about 95% of the water. We can have it's incredible. And we have a much lower carbon footprint. And we can preserve that farmland that would have been used in California for that. We can do other things with it, hopefully that are much less water intensive. Now, it's not a silver bullet because, we're kind of limited to leafy greens, small fruits, things like strawberries. And, if you've ever eaten a strawberry in winter, you're like, why did I bother? Why did I bother? Where did this come from? It may have been manufactured, may as well have been manufactured. So we can now produce really high quality strawberries in the same town we're in.
Wow.
We'll see it expand. And yeah, it's one of these technologies we can use to really efficiently produce a lot of food on a much smaller footprint, which gives us the alternative to rewild some of that land, which is so critical.
I think that is a really good point because it's like you said, it's not a silver bullet, but once you really understand almost like a life cycle analysis, if we're not using this land for agriculture, what are we using it for? And I guess kind of on a side note, something I'm really actually quite happy about is certain nations around the world paying more money to farmers who are actually rewilding their land. New Zealand and Scotland come to mind when I'm thinking of these types of initiatives. But that's a really good point. And I like the fact that you admitted that it's not a silver bullet, because I find that in these conversations, people tend to be either all in or all out. And when it comes to hydroponics, it is part of a grand scheme. And I suppose as a farmer, of someone with, let's say, the traditional way of farming, should they be threatened by something like hydroponics?
I really don't think so. And the way I look at it here, here in the north, where we do have a really sharp winter season, it's a great way for traditional farmers to use a small corner of their farm to actually produce year round. So we do see a lot of traditional farmers actually moving into indoor growing hydroponics greenhouses for part of their farm to even out their income a little bit. So I think it's a nice add-on. And you kind of think of it as an add-on. That there's going to be, like here in Canada, there's going to be 4 months of the year where there's really a lot of things growing, and that's great. But for those other 8 months, you want to be getting the food from somewhere else. And, it also allows us to stop importing foods into places that are too hot as well, weirdly enough. So I think of the Gulf states, for example, the Emirates, etc. They are looking at this technology. Also, Singapore is looking at this technology because it's a very small place. They don't have any farmland. And so it gives you new tools. And I see it as very complementary.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems to be like it's part of a solution. And what I'm curious about is, let's say, okay, I'm excited about these hydroponics and the fruits and vegetables, and maybe I want to try it. Is there I don't know about how it works around your end, but I've never seen in the shops around our end of the world that says grown via hydroponics in the grocery store, which would be important for someone who actually wants to reduce their footprint. They want to be looking for, okay, I've got this imported cabbage and then I've got this cabbage without a label. Is that hydroponically? Is it just a labeling mistake? Where do you see that heading?
Yeah, and I think we will see more labeling that specifically talks about the strengths of these technologies. And here in British Columbia, we actually have a brand that, it actually is an indoor brand. And, It's not available everywhere, though. That's the problem. I think we will start to see people say, grown indoors locally year round, And I mean, they have other things they can stress too, like no pesticides, no herbicides. It's so I think labeling is going to be really interesting and is something that's just catching on. But early days, but I think it is one place I'm very optimistic that we will have better salads in 10 years. That's my
Yes.
promise to
For the
everyone.
salad lovers, we are
Yeah,
loving
well,
that.
as someone who's plant-based, I want my salad to be good. I don't
Yeah.
want it to be terrible. And so yeah, hopefully we will have like, Berkeley quality salads year round. I don't know, just
Beautiful.
excellent salads,
I
hopefully.
love that. Something you mentioned, pesticides and herbicides. From my research, and this is quite a divisive topic, I would say, like a lot of people specifically don't want to eat foods that contain pesticides. And while I don't technically always look at that way, I understand the concern because in the US in particular, I know that there were certain pesticides that were used for many years before they decided it was dangerous.
Mhm.
And so I get where they're coming from, but when it comes to hydroponics, I feel like a huge market for them will be these people that don't want, because obviously you don't need that because you don't have the predatory insects that eat these plants. But at the same time, in my mind, I'm like, then you can't say it's organic. So it's GMO, but free from pesticides and herbicides. Am I on the right track here?
Well, it depends, because the truth is some indoor production is organic.
Really?
But yeah, so in the US, if you're using organic inputs into your hydroponics, you can call that product organic. So what that means is you'd be using an organic mix to create your liquid that feeds the plants. And of course, the plants don't have to be GMO. Some might be
Mm-hmm.
in say the U.S. and Canada, but there's also plants used indoors that are bred through conventional breeding to be kind of short, because that's usually what you're going for, short and quick. Here in Canada, it depends. In British Columbia, you're not allowed to call that organic. Organic actually has to be in soil by kind of definition, but it's an interesting question. And it's like you say, to me, I would much rather get rid of the pesticides and herbicides because I don't want them on my greens.
Mm.
And I mean, I wash my greens like one
Yeah.
does, but you grow indoors, you don't need to, because yeah, like you say, you want the bugs to stay away, you shut the door. That's a really good technology. It's very solid. So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of sort of interesting crossover in these categories. And yeah, I'm really excited about where they're going to go too. There's limits, of course, to what you can grow indoors. And we're going to
For
have to get a
now.
lot smarter. Oh yeah, and we're going to have to get smarter on how we grow things outside too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's go into that. How do you think? What is the problems of the ways that we're growing things outside, or what are the ones that you think need a particular amount of attention?
Well, we definitely have spent at least 50 years strip mining soil in a few areas of the world where we produce a lot of crops. Now, our biggest problem is that most of our crops go to animal feed, and that's problem number one. But even where we are growing for humans, we're really bad at not taking care of the soil when we do want to it. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the emerging area of regenerative agriculture. I mean, it's early days. It's hard to even say what that term means a lot of times, but I think we're going to see that and a lot of it's common sense, like rotating crops, like not growing the same
Mm.
thing year in year out, not leaving bare soil, making sure there's cover crops, smaller fields, hedge rows, things like that. Um, on the sort of common sense, sort of more old school ways, but then also using technology. And so one of the things that I follow is sensor technology, where you basically, your field has sensors that tell you what's happening. So instead of watering the whole field, maybe you only water the places that need water, which is really critical right now.
Yeah.
Or you have drones that are going along and they're like, oh, these 3 berry plants are sick. Let's hit them with some pesticide. But you don't blanket the whole field. And I think we're going to see a lot of that. And it saves money for farmers. It saves water, which is becoming a critical issue. So I think we're going to see a lot of that going forward. Really smart application of both common sense and technology.
I think what I really like, and I guess what I think the opportunity here is, before I say I don't like something, I think people, this isn't utopic society. Like, this is technology that is, one, to my understanding, being trialed right now at certain varying degrees, and two, not far off from actually being implemented at a decent scale. And I think this was the thing a little while back, maybe even last year, I read that I think it was Bill Gates that wanted to implement this in India, but there was like a lot of farmers' rights. They felt like they weren't in control of their cropland, which there will be a lot of, I think, cultural systemic beliefs that will have to change in order to bring this technology. And there's going to be so many problems that we're going to find in the rollout. So when you say early days, and I want to know if I'm on the right track here, I'm like, I don't think it's early days for the technology. I think it's early days for the implementation and making people understand what this technology can do.
Exactly. And it's very uneven in how it's applied right now. And so there's large parts of the world where these technologies simply aren't available yet. And what we see is they struggle a lot more with providing, you know, income on farm, ready crops, making sure that they're producing as much as possible with as little as possible. So yeah, we're still in a stage of rollout. And I mean, all the technologies we've talked about so far, yeah, they exist, they're happening, they're kind of being implemented here and there. But even here in Canada, we run into problems still, such as not every farmer has high-speed internet. And
Mm.
if your tractor needs to talk to the internet to do what it does, that's a real problem.
Yeah, I
And
never even
so,
thought about that. That seems like a huge issue, especially I know with farmers in particular. They also have this issue with John Deere. I think it's an international brand, and they don't actually have the right to repair those tractors. And so they have this monopoly on having to go to the one supplier, and now they need fast internet. And for anyone who's driven through a rural area,
oh
you can see the
yes.
very clear problem in that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's infrastructure we need to develop to make this work. And it also does require relying on technology in a way that some farmers, it is new to them. I mean, it's a little like, when I drive around in my car, there's nothing in my car I can fix anymore. And, I grew up in a rural environment where my family had a bunch of old trucks from like 70s and 80s that you literally could take a wrench and take apart and put back together. My car now is just like a computer with wheels. You can't do that anymore. And for farmers, I think they're experiencing the same thing. And it's just like with people in cars. Some farmers are like, yeah, bring it on, bring all the technology, anything you can do to put my farm on my smartphone sounds great. Other farmers do struggle, or they simply don't have access to what they need, i.e., internet or upfront financing to deal with
Mm.
capital cost of some of these. And it can be tough, and especially for smaller farmers. And we are seeing what's happening in a lot of other industries is small producers, they tend to get bought out, and you get slightly bigger operations, and that can be quite jarring. Trying to
Yeah.
make a small farm work. Now, weirdly enough, growing indoors, you actually can make a small farm work, which is kind of fun. It's there's these few food businesses that work well at small scale. Microbrewing is another one that I really like. in that, four friends with a little bit of a nest egg can come together and start a microbrew and do pretty well. And I
Yeah.
think that's what I really love about some of these ag tech. They almost even the scale a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because people have been doing this for, I think, decades with beer, and yet we think it's not
Mhm.
possible with plants. So it's essentially they're both living organisms. Why not grow them yourself at home? Which is something I'm really excited about. I feel like culturally, at a global level, we're at this place where more and more people feel the value of growing their own food, even if it's just like a little pot plant of coriander that's growing on their kitchen desk. I feel like that's a very cool opportunity to really connect with food a bit more and appreciate that. And at one point, I'm thinking once people really understand how hard it is, because it is difficult, especially if you look at a farmer's life, which is why I really am very pro these technologies, because I understand after speaking to many farmers how difficult it is to manage a property that is potentially many hectares, to then have the average person being able to connect with that growing process and how difficult it is and show that appreciation, I feel like will culturally be a very significant part in our evolution in the agricultural sector.
I think it is so true. And, it's even IKEA has a really decent little, countertop
Yeah.
grow your own basil rig. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is pretty cool. I actually quite like those. I think they're very cute. Maybe not the most efficient thing, but hey, even the light in the plant is nice and it smells good. So yeah, I think we're more and more people are interested in saying, well, gee, I've got a little tiny deck. What can I grow there? I've got a backyard. Is there something I could do with it that would
Mm.
give me a little fresh fruit? I think it's a really interesting time for that. And, not always the most efficient way to do things, but a lot of other benefits, like you say, very, very high on the education value of teaching people that actually, yeah, this is really hard. And when we go
Mm.
to the grocery store, we're really lucky because someone did it for us.
Yeah, look, I think education is very heavily undervalued. It's something that is absolutely crucial to the way that we think about all things, whether it's the way that we assess claims that are done online, whether it's the way that we understand how food is grown, what's in season, how do we reduce our carbon footprint if that's in your values. You can't do any of that without at least a baseline foundation of understanding how the food system and the food industry works. Because I feel like people are disconnected with the industry at a large. People think, oh, they're purchasing from a small farmer, when it's more likely that they're actually purchasing from an industrialized um, concept that is not, especially when you look at the animal agriculture side of things, they're not nice to the farmers in terms of the concepts that they force them in quotes to adopt.
Yeah, and I mean, animal agriculture is infamous for this, in that it is for a lot of producers in the industrial system, especially in places like the US, where it's highly mechanized, highly just in time. No, it is not friendly to the farmers or the workers. Certainly not the slaughterhouse workers, certainly not
Mm.
anywhere on the food chain. And I don't know. I just have I'll pretend that it was my wise old grandmother said, never trust the industry that won't let you go in and film what it does, because
Mm.
something's going on there you don't want to see. And I think, all I know is I've never met like a broccoli farmer that would mind me going in and like taking a video of the broccoli. And I think we perhaps we should question a little bit what they're not showing us always.
Definitely. So I want to change gears for a moment to a very deep, debated, and almost philosophical space that you mentioned earlier, which is regeneration and regenerative agriculture. I think what you mentioned earlier, you specifically talked about it being early days. which couldn't be more accurate. Something that, to my understanding, hasn't really been proven at a very large scale. However, in theory, I understand its merits and its possibilities if it is really indeed realistic. So, as a geographer, I think you would understand this a lot more than myself as a layman. But you mentioned like the soil erosion and the tilling. Is that when you look at regenerative agriculture, that term? I'd love for you to define the term as you see it, and maybe what are the potential benefits, and maybe even after that, potential downsides we can see from moving into that space.
Yeah, and I think it's one of these concepts that's it's got a lot of buzz right now, perhaps a little too much buzz, in that no one's really entirely defined it. And
Yep.
it really emerges out of the western part of Australia, and a few farmers who started who were looking at their grazing, and they were running conventional cattle where they're corn fed and part of the year, but also grazing, and there's a lot of erosion. And they started to say, well, what if we just had the cattle do grazing, but we had way less of them? Like we had a more normal amount of animals. And they started to notice that their soil started to come back. And that's been picked up in North America, and it's used. It's kind of a laundry. It's like a catch-all now from I altered, and I mean this. A lot of this stuff is good. So like on the prairies, we swap lentils and wheat back and forth so
Mm-hmm.
that the soil doesn't burn out. And they've been doing that for ages. They didn't need a term for it, but in a way that's regenerative. And we're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But we also are seeing some of the bigger operations kind of pick the term up, and you're kind of like, well, what do you mean? Are you going to decrease the number of cows you're running on your land? No. Well, then what are you actually doing to make it regenerative? It's hard to really measure what's going on, but I still like it, and I'll bounce what could be a very silly idea off you, but one that's kind of I'm taken to is, so here in Canada, the cattle industry is really pushing this idea of, well, we'll do more grazing, and then it's regenerative because the animals graze and they fertilize the land.
Mm-hmm.
And I got it into my head that, well, if you follow that logic, though, the cow in Canada is, of course, an invasive species. It's not supposed to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And what would be there in a lot of these, prairie farms are bison, woods bison and plains bison. And I started thinking, well, what if you put back bison instead of cows? That would be even better, because in winter, the cows can't actually survive outside. You have to bring them inside. But the bison are just fine because, they're fluffy. And so I'm like, well, that would be great. And then of course, being plant-based, I was like, well, then what if you don't kill them? What if you just look at them? And I thought, well, what if you price the carbon they're sinking into the soil? And so you could almost have a no-kill regenerative where you took a rancher and you kind of turn them into like a game park kind of manager who's sinking carbon and charging tourists to come look at these amazing animals. So if you've never seen a live bison, they're really, really cool. And I thought, well, okay, that's kind of silly, but I'm going to park it in my little idea cloud. But then I've started coming across all of these ranchers, mostly in Europe, and animal operations that are literally getting rid. They're going out of the meat business, and they're rewilding their land and maybe incorporating some of the animals that are supposed to be there to rebuild soil, and they are taking people to look at them. And it's like you say, there's this, when you start thinking in different terms, I think there's a lot of potential. So yeah, that was a long way to say, hard to say. I mean, yes, it's clearly a good idea not to just, graze and farm soil until it's destroyed. Clearly, it's good to use techniques that don't do that, but we're not quite sure what they are yet. And I think as someone, looking at plant-based alternatives, I'm like, well, what does it mean if you don't eat the animals and you just like look at them, take pictures of them? And so I think we haven't really defined what regenerative is, but I will leave that little bit of a controversial statement. What if true regenerative systems don't involve killing and eating the actual animals, but just letting them be there doing their thing?
I mean, you can definitely be out here sharing that because, like you said, there is no uniform definition. So I
Mm.
guess with that, it wouldn't be productive to look at it so black and white, but there's certain levels of regeneration, and the top level may be completely a death-free or a animal agriculture-free
Yeah.
zone, and then there's certain levels, and each come with their own carbon intensity, carbon offset, and some of the concepts there I really like. In countries like, I think it's Switzerland actually, they actually pay you extra if you have less uh, less cows per acreage of area. So if you have one cow per 2 acres, you'd get paid more than having one cow per 1 acre. And so it develops this system because we don't want to screw over the farmer, but something, or look, I'm saying farmer, but again, it's an industrialized, monopolized system that you're most likely buying from. But what you said about the Australian farm in Western Australia, I think was really fascinating. You mentioned very specifically less ruminant animals or less cows. And I think
Yes.
that's the key. People think that there's going to be the same amount of
Mm.
cows with this regenerative system. And when we've already used 1/3 of the arable land, or 2/3, sorry,
Yeah.
what is the, what, there's
So
no,
that is the downside. If you call it I mean, I don't see it as a downside, but I suppose if you actually want to go and eat steak every day at a ridiculously low price, it is a downside. That if everything was regenerative, we would have about 20% of the cows we do now. And
20%. And
about
how did they
20%.
figure that out? Do you know?
I work with a group out of Guelph, led by Dr. Evan Fraser, and that's his kind of back of the envelope calculation.
Yeah.
They sort of do efficiencies, and yeah, it's like you say. I mean, the reason that intensive agriculture can put a burger on your plate for a couple of dollars in the U.S. Um, is because you're cheating in a way. You're growing all this corn and pouring into the system. And yeah, if you go strictly to grazing and strictly to grazing that's not overgrazing, 20%, maybe 25 if you really really worked it, if you also did some genetic alterations. But yeah, people would have to get used to eating a lot less meat. But of course, that's kind of my gig, trying to convince them to do that. So maybe that isn't the worst thing in the world. But yeah, there would be some sticker shock, would also cost a lot more. So they would be
Hmm.
paying a lot more per pound.
Yeah, I wonder what the actual poundage is because there are a lot of people who really love their beef, and so their justification is, no, I'll just go regenerative to lower my impact here. And yes, right now you go to the supermarket, and truthfully, I have no idea how much meat costs
Neither
because
do
it's
I.
been that long. Yeah.
Yeah, neither do I. So yeah.
But let's say it's, I don't know, $30 a kilo for regenerative, and I could be way off. And with that figure, that the ruminant animals will have to decrease down to 20% of what we currently have, I can assume the price of the regenerative steak or beef will actually rise a further 80% at least. Like, I'm not sure what the figures are and whether, like, realistically, I don't know if people who tout regenerative ruminant animals really understand the concept of they can have maybe 25 grams to 50 grams of cow a week to maintain the level of possibility in this realm.
Yeah, I don't think that they're really aware of that. And I don't know. And I mean, maybe it is a bit of a segue. One of the other technologies I do follow is cellular agriculture,
Mhm.
where call it burger in a vat. And maybe that's the way you make regenerative work. is you grow a lot of your protein other ways, including, cell culture and precision fermentation. And so it may be that, we see a lot more people, maybe they have a steak once a month, and the rest of the time they're eating either plant-based or maybe they're getting their burger in a vat. And we'll have to see where it goes, where the technologies go. But yeah, the end of the absolute bottom line is there's no way regenerative produces as much as conventional, and that is just physics. And you can't argue with physics.
That's what I like about the environmental argument. Is it's there is some discrepancies with the numbers, and I'm sure you can misconstrue some of the papers and some of the studies to say, oh, this means that. Like there was a study that came out last year that said beef was more planet friendly than lentils, and they forgot to take into account the actual transportation, and they didn't even count the feed that you fed the animal. So there's ways to misconstrue a paper and mislead the public, which is very unfortunate. But cellular agriculture is very fascinating, and it's something I am beyond excited about. And it's something I personally won't partake in too much, but I'm definitely curious to try it, maybe. Like we've had Jadira Teljada from Cellular Agriculture Canada on the show previously to explain how exactly it works. But the question, since you are so passionate and maybe even involved in the space, how long until we actually see this in the supermarkets?
Well, it really depends on product. And let me tell you a little field trip that my team and I did. We went down to San Francisco in April, and we did a tour of a lot of the cellular agriculture players, and we tried their product. And it was new for me and new for all of us, and a very interesting experience.
Talk to us about that. What did you consume, and what was it like?
Yeah, so the first off, we did go and we talked to Perfect Day, which of course is leading in the dairy space, and they make whey protein using genetically modified yeast and other organism, fungus, bacteria. Old technology, we use it for all sorts of things. It's already in the food system, but using it for dairy protein is kind of new. The amazing thing is that product's in the market, in that in the US, you can walk into a grocery store, if it's the right one, and you can buy ice cream and it'll say non-animal dairy. And that's what it is. It's dairy without the cow, and it's incredible. And, they're a $1.5 billion company now, and fairly rapidly. And so we did do a little taste test, because up here in Canada, we can't get it. And it's really good ice cream. And it was very strange, because I don't usually eat, I'm plant-based, so I don't eat dairy. But even when I did eat dairy, it always bothered me a little bit. And of course, they don't put the lactose in there. So, it's like lactose-free. But it was great. I couldn't really tell the difference. Although, to be fair, I haven't had animal dairy in quite a while. So some of the carnivores on the trip, they said, yeah, they could, like it was really close, like 99% of the way there, and better than some of the cheaper brands of ice cream. But
fantastic.
So that's on the market now, and I think we're going to see a lot of it. We're going to see a lot of precision fermentation dairy. It will start appearing along with animal dairy, and my favorite, oat milk. And to me, oat milk's just, they'll pry my oat milk out of my dead hands. I love oat milk. And there now, they've got my plug-in for the Canadian Oat Board, so there we go. No. But then going up the sort of Star Trek level a bit, the cellular meat.
Yep.
And a highlight of the trip is we were invited to Wild Type to try salmon that was grown in a bioreactor.
Wow.
And I'm a fisherman's daughter. I know my fish. And, grew up in the industry. My family owned a fishing company, so... very familiar with it. And, to be honest, culturally, not eating fish, and I do miss it a little bit. And so this was something I really wanted to do. And so the salmon, number one, it looked like salmon, 100%. The appearance was perfect.
Wow.
And so we got to try this cellular salmon. And, just raw with nothing on it, I would say it's like 95% of the way there in both taste and texture. And I bet if you made a poke bowl out of it, I wouldn't notice. And it blew my mind. It blew all of our minds. It was also, and it was so weird because, I haven't eaten meat in like 7 years. And my brain was like, whoa, now, that's not a plant. That is most definitely raw fish. Why are you eating raw fish? And one of the other members of my team is vegan as well, and she found it quite challenging as well, and that we just didn't know what to make of it. Like, what was this thing we were eating? So we were all really impressed. They're bringing down their price point now, so they've already brought it down by about a factor of 10. But they're not at a market price yet. So I say conservatively for that. Now that's like the most Star Trek of products because it's solid. It's a solid cube of meat. I would say like, I wouldn't even be surprised if it's another 10 years before that is common. I think ground beef and chicken nuggets, maybe 3 or 4 years, and you'll be able to buy it. Where it gets crazy, and where also egg proteins are coming along very rapidly. I think they're going to be there very shortly. Where it gets really interesting is when these products are cheaper than conventional. I mean, because they blow animal products out of the water on all sustainability measures, especially if you use green energy as an input. So once they're way more environmentally friendly, there's no slaughter, which I think future generations, if they're given the choice, that, we don't quite have. I mean, we do. We're clearly eating plants. But I think once it's an easy choice, and this has been my argument all along, if you can have a hamburger out of a vat that is cheaper, that is better for you, that is better for the environment, and probably tastes better, to be honest, you gotta be kind of a jerk to kill a 2,000-pound animal. I mean, you really do. And I actually think we'll look at a lot of the animal industries a bit like we look at, like, say, smoking or eating foie gras, for example, which of course is illegal in California. And we'll kind of give it side eye. It'll be legal to do probably, but we'll probably be like, oh yeah, my grandpa ate a steak and it was from a real cow, and everyone will be like, ooh. I mean, I think we may actually get to that point, especially when it gets cheaper. It gets really interesting fast. And yeah, so it kind of blew my mind. My whole team, we left there going, whoa. And definitely further along than I expected. I think what's really making the difference, we have this massive flow of venture capital entering the space.
Yes.
And yeah, I think, so yeah, fermented dairy, keep an eye out. Like, precision dairy you'll see it any day. It'll be there soon. Unless you're in Europe, where the fact that there is genetic modification used in the chain will slow it down a bit. Ground meat, chicken nuggets, maybe 3 years, maybe 5. Solid meat, like a steak or a roast or, a chicken breast, maybe as many as 10. But once it comes, there'll be lots of it.
That's amazing. That actually sounds quite hopeful and optimistic, which is something that we desperately need this decade, given the new IPCC report and whatnot, giving us the last stand to really make a difference. Something I just wanted to ask real quick, when I'm picturing this salmon, and you said cubes, I'm wondering, my question in the first place my mind went to is digestively, how did that feel?
It's so strange because I was, it was so mentally odd. Afterwards, I did kind of feel like, not sure what I think about that. I usually eat plants. I'm like, am I going to be able to even digest this after so long? And, it was fine. I felt fine. And, but, it is odd. I did come away thinking, these technologies are amazing. And I think it's really something that's worth it for all the benefits. But I did think, for me personally, I wouldn't rush back to a meat heavy diet just because it was possible. I mean, I actually feel fine on a plant based diet. I might just occasionally throw in I mean, if there were egg proteins, every now and then I'm baking something and I'm trying to figure out what to substitute for an egg. And, although to be honest, the plant-based egg substitutes now coming, out of I think it's used to be
just egg.
Yeah, just egg it actually bakes pretty well. So, even there, I mean, in a lot of ways, plants already do a lot of this, but for meat-heavy cultures, we need this tech. We just do, because it's not like everyone's going to stand up and become plant-based in time to get that kind of benefit. So I think it's really good. It's going forward. I don't know how much of it I would really eat. Like I said, maybe occasionally use an egg protein, maybe cheese. I like cheese. So I could imagine occasionally having a piece of blue cheese that was produced in this way. Yeah. So it's good. I think it's another tool for us. Fortunes are going to be made, and if we look at the meat industry, global meat and dairy is worth $2 trillion a year. There's so much room for improvement there. And I mean, you look at Perfect Day and they're worth $1.5 billion. And you're like, it's just a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the animal system. So I always say there are no silver bullets, but shifting away from intensive animal production in any way, shape, or form, be that regenerative, be that plant-based, be that cell, it is as close to a silver bullet for climate change as you can possibly get. And it's also nice because it's so incremental, and it's one of the few areas where individuals have a strong control. Like, you have absolute control over what you eat. And, I can't go and buy a Tesla tomorrow because they're really expensive and I couldn't even get one if I wanted. But I can go and get a veggie burger. And that's really cool.
I love all that, and it makes me really excited and hopeful, because making someone plant-based or convincing them of the benefits is quite a large hurdle when you're dealing with lots of different ideologies, cultural beliefs, personalities, and we're not trained on how to influence people in that way. Whereas if you just show them, hey, I can save you money, this will taste better and it's better for the planet, no one has to die. What are you, silly to not get that option? So I'm really excited for that aspect of these technologies. But that kind of brings me to one of the last questions I wanted to shoot your way, which is, we have these very exciting food technologies. What do you think we could do as a consumer, business, and or at maybe political levels to help further progress these technologies?
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot we can do. And number one, I think on the political level, is we need to be telling our politicians, please take climate change seriously. Because, at this point, it's ridiculous if they don't. And a lot of them do. Because, in Canada, half the country is on fire, the other half is underwater. So, we're taking it quite seriously, but we're still a petrochemical state. So there's a little, so number one, climate change needs to be solved. And at this point, I don't care how they do it. It just needs to be solved because we need that, number one. Number two, stop subsidizing the wrong things. And so, I talked to a broccoli farmer a while back, and I like broccoli. And so I was like, I was chatting with them. There's like very few broccoli farmers here, and I was chatting with them about the brassicas, and it's like, yeah, the government gives him nothing, and meanwhile, meat and dairy heavily subsidized. Grains, sometimes they have preferential treatment. In the US, the sugar industry has a lot of power, a lot of lobbying. It's like, won't someone please think about the poor vegetable farmer? So we need to look at our entire subsidy stream in each country. And they have to ask themselves, is this aligned with, say, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals? And if the answer is no, stop doing it. Redirect the money to other things. I also really do think we need to, if we're either educators or even if just in our own families, we need to get away from a weird romantic view of farming as like a red barn and a windmill and a couple cows. We need to be educating people as to what the industry really looks like, both the good and the bad. And, kind of not saying everyone should drag their kids through a slaughterhouse, but maybe they should. But maybe that needs to be like
maybe you're right.
Maybe that should be a high school field trip. It'd be a high up spike in veganism. And then as individuals, we need to make sure we're getting good information. We need to remember scientists actually don't have a hidden agenda for the most part, in that we just do research, and it's not like we get
that's very
paid
important
extra
to say. It's like, very important.
Like, all I know is if there's a giant like Illuminati of climate scientists that are like living it up, I'm not part of it, and where's my invite? But for the most part, scientists I know are hardworking. They seek the truth, and for the most part, physics doesn't lie. So, believe scientists. They're not out there to fool you into doing something weird.
Oh, for sure, Lenore. Let me tell you, the times I've had people comment on my posts on social media when I share the climate scientists just in different details, they always say, look at the agenda. I'm like, what agenda? I'm like, I read the IPCC. Go and tell me what agenda they could have when they're funded by the UN, and and then you're sending me stuff that's actually funded by industry. So you tell me who has an agenda. And it's so backwards how some people would really seem to be claiming these preposterous things just to reiterate their own belief systems and ideologies, so I'm really, really stoked and happy that you did mention that you're not part of some Illuminati conspiracy of climate change fascism.
Yeah, it's or I definitely, my invite got lost in the mail. And I think it is, I understand it's scary, and it's going to get way more scary. I wish it wasn't. I wish we had acted sooner. But, we're in a period where I actually don't think that many people don't believe in climate change anymore. But I find a lot of people are just getting a little hopeless, in that they look at the floods, the fires, the heat domes, and they're just like, well, I can't do anything. And the answer is, you can run for office, number one, and you can lobby the people who are in power. But I mean, we can do things. And it's one of the reasons I love food, because every day when we go to eat something, we can make choices that are good for our body, that are good for the world, that are good for labor conditions. And we can just do that. And, if one day we wake up and we don't, and we go like to the pancake house and like eat a giant mound of sugar and processed products, and hey, been there, done that. Hey, we can start at lunch and start again. Food is wonderful because every day is a clean slate. And it doesn't have to be like embraced with religious fervor. Just think about what you're eating. And it's one way to feel a bit empowered. And to be honest, I feel I feel empowered by my food choices, and it helps keep me optimistic when, last year we had an extreme heat event here that just totally obliterated all records. Um, killed about 500 people in British Columbia. It
Wow.
was 47, 48 degrees in the interior. It was 40 degrees here in Vancouver. Um, it's enough to make someone like me who studies this just not know what to do. But
Mm,
food helps me. Even growing a basil plant on your counter, you can at least feel like you have some control.
I love that. That's hot even for Australia. So
It
yeah,
was so
there is
hot.
so much we can do to help this planet. And I'm saying planet, but the planet will be here. It's to help us humans survive a extinction level
Yeah.
event because, like you said, 500 people died, and 500 people aren't really connected to that number, but that in most cases is more than every person that you're close with or know, family and friends. So I
Yeah,
can't
exactly.
understate
And
those
it's
numbers.
in a single weekend we lost more people than we lost in about 3 months of pandemic. And but we're not ready for that. And it's weird because at least in Australia, everything is built for it to be hot. In Canada, everything is built for it to be cold. And the UK is experiencing that this summer, where
Mm.
people are dying in temperatures where you're like, well, that doesn't sound that hot, but everything is built to keep heat in because it's not supposed to be hot there. And then flooding is the flip side of that. And we know it's going to be bad, but we can all work together, and we can. I mean, I don't know. I'm a bit of an optimist by nature, despite what I do, and so I think there's a lot we can do. But some of that does lead us back to plants, and I think it's pretty amazing what you can do with plants. And I will say this: that plant options have gotten so much better in the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. It's
Yeah.
way easier than it used to be. And although I like lentils, you don't just have to eat lentils anymore. There's many, many options. So I think it's a great step for people to take.
Fantastic. Look, I want to implore your optimism, and I think it is always a fantastic way to end a conversation with a hint of passion, optimism, and potentially even a platform or perspective to view forward to a future that is congruent with the change we want to see. So, thank you
Yeah.
so much, Lenore, for coming on and sharing your wisdom. I definitely got a lot out of this conversation. I hope those listening and/or watching did as well. You're someone I really appreciate in the space because one, you're not part of some Illuminati, but you're here sharing the facts in an optimistic way, which is something as a climate scientist, and I've had the privilege to meet and converse with a few, and even as a geographer, someone who understands the situation, the fact that you can communicate that in an effective way is very much appreciated because I know that communication is the key to expanding public knowledge and give us a perspective to have a future to look forward to and or see the solutions that we have amongst us currently. So I really appreciate the work you do, the incredible papers that you write, the books you put out. And for anyone who wants to connect with you further and or read your articles and or books, I'll leave that all linked in the show notes below. And thank you so much for your time today, Lenore, and we'll speak to you next time.
Well, thank you very much. And I will throw out the brief plug that in October I'm releasing a new book, Dinner on Mars, that is co-authored, and it looks at the question: what might we eat on the red planet if we ever went there? And a
Ooh,
bit of a hint: Elon Musk had better like plant-based, because I think it's highly likely that the best diet for the red planet is the same as the best diet for this one, which is heavy on the plants. So keep an eye out for that.
fantastic. Well, this episode will come out, I believe, November 21st. So that's actually
perfect
on the money
yes.
for that one. So I'll leave that linked in the show notes for people to check out.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was fun.
Hi there. Welcome to the end of the episode. Thank you for listening and or watching the whole way through. I really appreciate that. Thank you again to Lenore for coming on and sharing your wisdom. You can find all the links to connect with her in the show notes below. With that being said, to support the show, you can either leave a review on Apple or Spotify, and even on YouTube, you can like, comment, subscribe. It helps out a lot. The other way you can help out is by sharing this episode to a friend, family member, and colleague that you think would find benefit with the points that we discussed. With all that said, I will see you on next week's episode. Stay happy, eat plants, peace.